You can't just
or you
stand here and
what
do
you got
nothing.
in
We
your
demand
hand,
action
armed
now.
police.
Sir,
Detain
I
a
need you to
man
calm
with a
down.
knife in his
We are
hand,
addressing the
King Scar.
situation, but you must remain peaceful.
People rushed to work, some with coffee in hand, others hurriedly glancing at their phones. The sound of honking cars, distant chatter, and footsteps echoed through the busy sidewalks. It was the usual chaos, lively, yet somehow predictable. But amidst the everyday noise, something felt different. Something in the air was changing, and no one knew it yet. Among the crowd, a man walked with an unusual urgency, as if there was a storm inside him that no one could see. He didn't look like anyone special, just another man caught in the whirlwind of the city. His hair was unkempt, his clothes were a little wrinkled, and there was something about the way he moved that made him seem out of place. His eyes darted nervously from side to side, and his hands were clenched tightly around something he refused to let go of. He wasn't just another commuter, he was a man on the edge. A man whose emotions had gotten the best of him, and now he was walking with a single goal in mind, one that was driven by fear and frustration. No one could have known that just a few moments ago he'd been standing in his tiny apartment, the walls feeling like they were closing in on him. The argument had been heated, loud, and intense. The words had been exchanged, but they weren't just words. They were knives of frustration, cutting deeper with every passing second. The man had tried to stay calm. He really had. But sometimes, when life pushes you too far, you reach a point where the only thing you feel in your hands is the weight of all your troubles. And in that moment, what he held was not just a kitchen knife. It was the embodiment of every harsh word, every lost opportunity, every failure he had ever faced. As he stepped out of his apartment, the knife still tightly gripped in his hand, he told himself it was just a moment of weakness, a moment to clear his head, to think. He'd walk around, maybe take a breath, let the air fill his lungs and somehow find his way back to some sense of normalcy. He never meant for it to escalate, but as he walked through the crowded streets, each step seemed to carry more weight than the last. He didn't notice the looks from the people around him, how their faces twisted from indifference to confusion. He didn't notice how he was moving faster, his heart beating harder with each passing minute. His mind was a whirlpool, spinning out of control. The argument replayed over and over in his head, each replay more violent than the last. The words he should have said, the things he should have done. He had always tried to be strong, but now he wasn't sure how to even keep himself together. His emotions were a tangled mess, and the more he tried to untangle them, the more they knotted up, pulling him deeper. As he walked past a bakery, the scent of fresh bread wafted through the air, momentarily breaking through his thoughts. But just as quickly the smell was gone, replaced by the stench of anxiety that clung to him. He continued down the street, the knife still in his hand, though he didn't fully realize it. His mind was somewhere else entirely. In the distance, a woman walked her dog, oblivious to the man's presence. A car honked, snapping him out of his trance for a split second. For a moment he considered putting the knife down, but then the thought passed. The world around him was moving too fast, too loud, and too chaotic. It didn't seem like anyone really cared anyway. The people around him had their own problems to deal with, their own lives to live. And here he was, a man at the end of his rope, with nothing but the weight of his emotions in his hands. He turned a corner, his steps quickening now. His grip on the knife tightened as if it was the only thing grounding him to reality. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was certain of one thing: the anger inside him, the frustration, it wasn't going to go away until it had been released in some way. At that moment, a man crossing the street saw him. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. The stranger's face shifted, his smile fading as he realized what the man was holding. The brief glance was enough. There was something in the air now, something heavier than before. The stranger didn't know if the man was dangerous, but he knew enough to sense something wasn't right. As the stranger stepped away, The man with the knife kept walking. His pace quickened as his thoughts grew more erratic. The weight of the knife felt more real with each step, like a silent reminder of everything that was falling apart. He didn't care who saw him now, didn't care about anything except his own confusion. His eyes locked on the ground in front of him, but in his peripheral vision, he could see people starting to notice him more. A woman, walking with her child, glanced up and then quickly turned away, pulling the child close to her side. The noise around him seemed to fade, but the tension built up in his chest, and it wasn't just his chest. His whole body seemed to hum with anxiety. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Was he supposed to go home? Go to the park? He didn't know, but he couldn't stop moving. In the midst of his internal chaos, the city around him continued to hum. People continued to talk, walk, and live their lives, completely unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away from them. Then, without warning, a voice called out from the crowd. "Oi, you! What you got in your hand?" The sharpness of the voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. For the first time in what felt like hours, the man looked up. His eyes flickered towards the voice, and for a brief second he saw a figure in a uniform. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave. The voice belonged to a police officer, standing just a few feet away. It was the first real interaction he had had since leaving his apartment. And in that moment, it was clear that things were about to change, drastically. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, frozen, the knife still in his hand. It happened quickly. The moment the police officer's voice cut through the air, something inside the man shifted. It wasn't just the words that got his attention, it was the way they were said. The officer's tone was firm, almost demanding, but there was something else in it too. It wasn't just about asking what he was holding, it was about making sure that he wouldn't do anything with it. The man's mind raced. His body froze. The knife in his hand felt heavier now, as though it was an anchor weighing him down. For a brief moment, he thought about running, turning around and disappearing into the crowd, vanishing like the others who had quickly moved away from him. But his legs felt like they were made of stone. The air felt thick. His feet didn't want to move. Around him, the world continued on, oblivious to what was happening. The people walking by, some lost in their own conversations, some with their eyes glued to their phones, had no idea about the storm brewing in the middle of the street. But there was one woman, standing on the corner, who saw it all. She didn't know who the man was or why he was holding a knife, but she felt the danger, sharp and immediate. Her instincts kicked in before her brain could fully process it, and her hand reached for her phone. As her thumb tapped the screen, dialing the emergency number, her heart raced. She didn't have time to think about whether or not she was doing the right thing. She had to act. The woman's voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher, trying to stay calm while the situation escalated. "Hello, yes, there's a man on the corner of 5th and Main and he has a knife. He looks unstable. Please, you have to send someone quickly." The woman's eyes stayed on the man. She kept her distance but couldn't look away, her breath shallow and fast. As she spoke, the dispatcher on the other end was already starting to gather details, asking for a description of the man and his location. "Is he threatening anyone?" the dispatcher asked. The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking nervously toward the man. He wasn't threatening anyone directly, but his presence, the way he was holding the knife, it felt wrong. There was something about the way his shoulders were hunched, the wildness in his eyes that screamed danger. "No," the woman answered quickly, "but he could. He's walking through the crowd and people are starting to notice. Please hurry." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way and that she should try to stay out of sight, advising her not to approach the man. As the phone call ended, the woman's hand trembled, her heart still racing. She knew there wasn't much more she could do but wait. Meanwhile, the man with the knife stood frozen in place, his thoughts swirling in a storm. The officer's voice still echoed in his ears, but it seemed distant now, muffled by the chaos in his mind. Should he drop the knife? Should he run? Could he even make it out of here before the police arrived? Every thought felt like it was pushing him toward a decision, but none of them felt like the right one. The sound of sirens began to fill the air, growing louder by the second. The man's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized how much time had passed, but the approaching sound of the police made it all too real. It was as though the city itself had started to close in on him, and there was no escape. There was no way out of this now. The crowd began to disperse even more quickly, people looking nervously over their shoulders as they rushed to clear the area. They didn't want to be near a man with a knife. They didn't know who he was, what he wanted, or what he was capable of. All they knew was that danger had arrived and it was time to go. But for the man, there was nowhere to go. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to go anywhere. His grip on the knife tightened. A strange calm washed over him, a sort of detachment that felt unnatural, like his body was moving on its own while his mind watched from a distance. He heard the sirens, but they felt so far away, like they belonged to someone else's reality. His hands began to shake, but he didn't drop the knife. The police car screeched to a halt at the corner of the street, the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the surrounding buildings. The man couldn't look away from the lights. He couldn't look away from the officers who were quickly jumping out of the car, their movements coordinated and swift. They were ready. They were trained for situations like this, and they wouldn't hesitate. A shout rang out from one of the officers. "Drop the knife. Drop it now." The words cut through the man's thoughts like a blade. His eyes flicked toward the officer, but his feet still didn't move. He was trapped, caught between the man he had been just moments ago and the man he was becoming now. The man who had come so close to losing control, to letting everything inside him explode. The officers took quick, measured steps toward him, trying to maintain a safe distance while also keeping him in sight. They had to be careful. They had to be precise. It was clear that the man was confused, possibly scared, and in his current state he could do anything. "Put it down," another officer shouted, this time with more urgency. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity. The man's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The knife in his hand seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, and in that moment, it felt like the only thing keeping him connected to the world around him. He could see the officers moving closer, their faces determined but also cautious. They knew that this wasn't just about a knife. It was about a man who was on the edge. They had trained for moments like this, but there was always that uncertainty, that split second where things could go terribly wrong. The man's mind was spinning, but his body was still. It was as though he couldn't move anymore. His thoughts were like a whirlwind, spinning faster and faster, and his fingers slowly began to loosen their grip on the knife, though it was hard to tell if he even realized it. The officers were almost in position now, their hands hovering near their holsters, ready for anything. The crowd had thinned out, leaving behind only a few brave souls who watched from a distance, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. And then, just as quickly as the sirens had started, they seemed to fade away, replaced by the sound of footsteps. The officers were there, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for what would happen next. The air was thick with tension. It felt as though the entire city had come to a halt, with every person, every car, and every sound waiting for the next move. The man could hear the officers' footsteps growing louder with each passing second, their boots hitting the pavement with a rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Every second felt like it could be the one where everything changed, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He stood there, frozen, the knife still loosely gripped in his hand. The weight of it was no longer comforting. Instead, it felt like an anchor pulling him down deeper. His mind was foggy, thoughts slipping away as quickly as they came. But there was one thought that remained clear. He wasn't sure if he could put the knife down. He didn't know if he even wanted to. The world had become a blur, and the only thing that seemed real in that moment was the cold steel in his hand. The officers were now only a few feet away, their voices sharp and firm. "Drop the knife," one of them commanded again, his voice echoing through the stillness. But the man didn't respond. He couldn't find the words. His throat felt tight, as though something was choking him from the inside. The knife seemed to grow heavier in his hand, like it was weighing down on his very soul. One officer moved to the side, trying to create a better angle, while the other stayed focused on the man's face, trying to gauge his next move. They were calm, too calm, it seemed, but that was the way they had been trained. To stay composed in moments like this, when the stakes were high and everything could change with one wrong move. For a moment, the man thought he might do it. He thought he might just let go of the knife, drop it to the ground, and finally release all the confusion, all the frustration that had been building up inside him. But as he raised his eyes to look at the officers, he saw something in their faces, something that made his heart skip a beat. They were not just looking at him, they were looking at the knife. They were prepared, ready for any sudden movements. That realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't just standing there, confused and scared. He was part of something bigger now. The entire world had shifted, and he wasn't sure where he fit in anymore. The knife in his hand was not just a symbol of his anger or fear. It had become a symbol of the danger he was now a part of. It was no longer just about him. It was about what would happen next, what the officers would do, and how the world would respond. He swallowed hard, trying to get control of his breath, but it came in sharp, panicked bursts. His eyes flickered between the officers, the crowd behind them, and the ground beneath him. The streets, once so familiar and full of life, now felt like a trap, closing in on him from every direction. He wanted to scream, to say something, anything to make sense of what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. His body felt paralyzed, his hands trembling, the knife slipping slightly in his grip as if it had a mind of its own. One of the officers stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. The other officer remained back, his hand still near his holster, ready to react if things went sideways. The officer in front kept his gaze locked on the man's eyes, trying to make a connection. "We don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just drop the knife. No one has to get hurt." The words seemed to cut through the fog in the man's mind just for a second. There was a small part of him that wanted to believe it. That small voice inside him, the one that had been quiet for so long, finally spoke up. He wasn't a bad person. He never meant for things to get this far. The knife had been an accident, a mistake. He just needed to get away from everything, to escape from the overwhelming weight of life. But the fear inside him wasn't so easily silenced. He could feel it rising again, a tight knot in his chest. What if he dropped the knife and they still saw him as a threat? What if they didn't believe he was just confused? The officers were closing in, and with every step they took, the man felt like his world was shrinking. The noise of the sirens, the footsteps of the officers, even the distant voices of onlookers, it all mixed together into a single, suffocating sound. The man's grip tightened once more, his knuckles white as he held onto the knife. A small voice inside his head told him he could still leave. He could still run. If he just took a step back, if he turned around, he could escape the scene, disappear into the city. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the officer's eyes, calm but resolute, staring at him like they saw through the walls he had built around himself. Maybe it was the realization that there was no running away from this moment anymore. Maybe it was the understanding that what happened next would determine everything. Another voice broke through the tension. "Drop it now." This time, the command was sharp, urgent. The officer who had been trying to get closer was now in position, his hand on his taser, ready for any sudden moves. The man's breath caught in his throat. Time seemed to stretch, each second crawling by like an eternity. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, knife still in hand, eyes locked with the officers, but it felt like hours. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like 1,000 bricks, and every part of him screamed for release. And then it happened. In a quick, almost instinctive movement, the man let go of the knife. It fell to the ground with a soft clang, a noise that sounded louder than any of the sirens or shouting. The moment it hit the pavement, the tension seemed to snap, like the last thread holding everything together had broken. The officers moved swiftly, closing the distance between them. One officer dropped to the ground beside the man, pushing him to his knees, his hands going up to secure him in place. For a brief moment, everything was still. The only sound was the man's rapid breathing, his chest rising and falling with the force of panic. His mind was still racing, but the overwhelming weight of the knife was gone. He was no longer holding on to it. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he was free from the object that had been controlling him. The officers didn't say anything more. Their movements were precise and quick as they cuffed him, the cold metal wrapping around his wrists, a sharp reminder that everything had changed. The world around him felt different now. It was as if the fog had lifted, and for the first time in a long time, the man could see things clearly. But he didn't know what would happen next. The crowd was still watching, the sirens still blaring in the background. And he didn't know if he was ready to face the consequences of what he had done. The world seemed to pause as the officers carefully secured the man to the ground. His knees were pressed into the cold pavement, and the hard metal of the handcuffs clicked into place with an unsettling finality. The man barely registered the movements of the officers as they gently but firmly pushed his arms behind his back, locking him in place. His mind was still reeling from the chaos that had just unfolded, his heart hammering in his chest. For a brief moment, all the noise, the sirens, the distant voices of onlookers, the beating of his own pulse faded away, and there was nothing left but silence. In the midst of that silence, the man's thoughts raced. How had he gotten here? A few moments ago, he had been walking through the busy streets, his life slipping through his fingers. Now, his hands were cuffed, and he was surrounded by officers. The world that had once felt so familiar now seemed foreign, like he was standing on the edge of some great unknown. One of the officers knelt down beside him, speaking in a calm, almost reassuring voice. "You're okay now. You're not in trouble, just take a deep breath." The man didn't respond. His chest was still tight, his body trembling with the shock of it all. He had never imagined his day would turn out like this, not in a million years. It was as if everything had gone wrong in the blink of an eye, and now there was no going back. As the officers carefully helped him to his feet, he noticed that the crowd had started to thin out, though a few curious faces still lingered nearby. Some were watching from behind the safety of a building or a car, while others held their phones up, recording the moment. It was strange, he thought. These people, these strangers, had seen it all unfold, and yet they would walk away from it, just as they had done with all the other events of the day. The city would keep moving, indifferent to his personal crisis. He wanted to say something, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened? How could he make anyone understand that he had never wanted it to go this far? He hadn't meant for any of it to happen. But now, as the officers led him toward the patrol car, he felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He had no idea where they were taking him, or what would happen next, but somehow, he knew his life was about to change forever. The officers guided him gently into the back of the patrol car. The door shut behind him with a dull thud, and the weight of it felt heavier than any of the moments that had come before. The car started to pull away from the scene, the flashing lights fading into the distance as they drove further into the heart of the city. The man's mind was still clouded with confusion, but there was one thing he was certain of now. He had crossed a line. He didn't know exactly what that line was, but he knew he couldn't go back. As they drove through the streets, the man stared out the window. The city looked the same as it had when he'd walked through it earlier, full of life and movement. But now it felt like a distant memory, like a dream he was no longer a part of. His thoughts were muddled, but one thing was clear. He had reached the point where the choices he made would define everything from here on out. He had acted out of desperation, out of confusion, and in the end, he had come face to face with the consequences of his actions. He thought back to that moment when the officer had first shouted at him to drop the knife. He could still hear the urgency in the officer's voice, the sharpness that had pierced through the fog in his mind. He had been so scared, so unsure of what to do, that he had held on to the knife like it was the only thing that could keep him grounded. But now, as he sat in the back of the car, the cold metal cuffs pressing into his wrists, he wondered how close he had come to something far worse. He hadn't intended for things to escalate. He hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, but somewhere along the way, he had lost control. And now, as the car turned down unfamiliar streets, he realized that everything, his life, his future, was up in the air. There was no way of knowing what would happen next, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The car finally came to a stop outside a building he didn't recognize. It was a sterile, gray structure, with tall windows that reflected the light of the city. The officers helped him out of the car, and he was led into the building, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He was still in shock, still processing everything that had happened, but he knew that he was no longer just a man wandering through the streets. He was now someone who had been caught in the middle of a system far bigger than himself. Inside, the cold, fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he was led into a small room. The walls were plain and featureless, and there was a table in the center of the room. He was instructed to sit down, and one of the officers left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The door clicked shut, and for the first time he was left in complete silence. It felt like hours passed before anyone came back, though it was likely only a few minutes. Another officer entered, this one carrying a clipboard and a pen. He sat down across from the man, his eyes kind but serious. "We need to talk about what happened," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "I know this isn't easy, but it's important that you understand what's at stake." The man nodded, his mouth dry, but he didn't speak. He had no idea what to say. The officer asked him a few questions: what had happened leading up to the incident, what he had been thinking, and why he had felt the need to carry the knife. The man gave short, shaky answers, still processing the events that had led him here. As the officer spoke, the man felt a strange sense of clarity starting to form. The weight of everything he had done, of everything that had happened, was slowly sinking in. This wasn't just about one bad decision. This was about the choices he had made over time, the things that had led him to this moment. And now there was no turning back. He wasn't sure what would happen after this. Would he face charges? Would he go to jail? Would anyone ever understand what had led him to make the decisions he did? These questions hung in the air, unanswered. But for the first time since the incident, the man felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something he didn't understand yet, but something that could change the course of his life. The room felt cold, even though it wasn't physically cold at all. It was the kind of cold that wrapped around you from the inside, creeping through your chest and leaving a chill that you couldn't shake. The man sat alone, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the choices he had made. He hadn't spoken much since he was brought here, only responding when asked. The questions kept coming. What had led him to this moment? Why had he been carrying the knife? And what had been going through his mind? But no matter how much he thought about it, the answers didn't seem to make any sense. He had been angry, confused, and unsure. That much was clear, but there was more to it than that. There had been 1,000 small moments leading up to this, moments he had ignored, dismissed, or tried to bury deep inside himself. He had never planned for his day to end like this. How could he have known that walking through the streets with a knife in his hand, a symbol of his anger and frustration, would lead to a situation where he was facing the consequences of his actions? The silence in the room was overwhelming. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It wasn't the kind of silence where you could sit with your thoughts and reflect. No, this silence was the kind that came from a decision made too late. The kind that settled into the pit of your stomach, leaving you feeling heavy and uncertain. He thought back to the moment when the police had surrounded him, when he had stood frozen, the knife still in his hand. That moment felt like it had happened in slow motion. He remembered the officer's voice, sharp and commanding, telling him to drop the knife. It had been so simple, that command, so clear. And yet, at that moment, he had felt trapped. Trapped by his own fear, by his own frustration, and by the thought that there was no way out of the situation he had created. When he had finally let go of the knife, it had felt like a release, but also like a surrender. He had done what they asked, but in doing so, he had given up something important. He didn't know exactly what it was, but it felt like a part of him had been lost when the knife hit the ground. A part of him that had been holding on to the anger, the fear, the confusion, and the shame. Dropping the knife hadn't just been about releasing the object. It had been about giving up control, and for someone who had felt like they were losing everything, that was a hard pill to swallow. The officer had been calm. That calmness in the midst of everything had been unnerving. The officer had said it wasn't too late to make things right, that no one had to get hurt. But now, in the quiet of the room, the man wasn't so sure. Could things really be made right after everything that had happened? Could he really fix what was broken? He was still sitting in the same cold room, with nothing but his thoughts and the faint sound of distant voices beyond the door. He hadn't seen anyone in a while, but he could hear footsteps from time to time, the occasional door opening and closing. He had no idea what the next steps were. Would he be held here? Would he be charged with something? Would he go to jail? The questions hung in the air, but there were no answers yet. The uncertainty felt like a weight on his chest, heavier than anything else in that moment. The door to the room opened suddenly, and a woman stepped in. She was dressed in a simple uniform, holding a clipboard in her hands. She was one of the officers from earlier, though the man didn't recognize her face. She smiled slightly, a warm but professional smile, and sat down across from him. "We're going to help you," she said, her voice calm and gentle. "But first, I need you to understand something. What happened today, it doesn't define who you are. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. You made a mistake and you're here now, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the road." The man didn't know how to respond. What could he say? He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this wasn't the end. But it was hard. It was hard to accept that this moment, this terrifying, chaotic moment, was just a chapter in his life. He felt like it had consumed him, that it had changed everything in a way he couldn't fully understand. Could he really move on from it? Could he ever feel like himself again? The woman continued, "You've been through a lot, and we can help you work through it. But you need to be honest with yourself. It's important to understand why things happened the way they did. If you can do that, if you can take responsibility for your actions, it will be the first step toward healing." Healing. The word hung in the air, its weight heavy. Healing from what exactly? From the anger, the fear, the sense of helplessness that had driven him to this point. He didn't know how healing worked, not for something like this. It wasn't as simple as just saying sorry or promising to do better next time. No, this was more complicated than that. He thought about the people who had been watching. The bystanders, the ones who had seen the whole thing unfold from a distance. What did they think? Did they see him as a threat? Did they understand that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen? Or had they just seen a man with a knife, someone who posed a danger to them, to everyone around him? His mind drifted to the officers. They had been calm, but had they been afraid too? Had they seen him as a threat, Or had they seen him as someone who needed help? The way they had handled the situation with precision and care had surprised him. He hadn't expected it to go that way. In his mind, he had expected things to escalate, to spiral out of control, but they hadn't. Somehow they had been able to bring everything back down to earth to make sure that no one got hurt. But was it too late for him? Could he go back to his old life? Could he find his way out of this? He didn't know. He didn't know if anyone could fix what was broken inside him, if he could ever truly move on from this day. But there was a part of him that wanted to try. There was a part of him that wanted to believe that everything wasn't lost, that he could make it out of this, that he could rebuild what had been broken. For the first time since everything had started, he felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was just the beginning. The officer stood up, her clipboard in hand. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said gently. "But I want you to think about what you're going to do next, what you need to do for yourself." The man nodded, though he still wasn't sure what the next step would be. He wasn't sure about anything. But for the first time, he felt like there might be a way forward, even if it was just a tiny, uncertain path. As the door closed behind the officer, he sat there alone, thinking. And for the first time since it all began, he felt like he wasn't alone in the struggle. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal.